Let's learn about how animal populations work. So, this was about 40 years of my life, so I hope I can get through this and teach you something. So, when we look at populations from a conservation standpoint, we try to maintain some kind of equilibrium. And basically, you're talking about equal between birth and immigration and death and emigration. So, first thing you need to be aware of in conservation is what are the most important determinants of birth rates. And for example, on large animals like a deer, we might want to know the proportion of females breeding in the population. We want to know the average number of litters produced by each female, the average litter size produced by a pregnant female. So we'll produce models that actually try and predict what different populations are doing. And you have to consider when the life history, what we call the reproductive life history of different animals. On one side of it, you have what's called the R-selected species. R-selected species have very short lifespans and produce a lot of young. They have a much higher birth rate. They sexually mature early, short gestation period. There's little or no parental care. So in the upper right-hand side where the octopus is, some species of octopi lay 2 million eggs. On the sockeye salmon below, they lay about 10,000 eggs in a clutch. Now, how many of those need to survive for that population to remain stable? 2. Only 2. So their strategy is, even though they don't provide any parental care, because the sockeye salmon and the octopus die shortly after breeding, is I'm going to produce so many young, at least 2 to survive, and the population will remain stable. The opposite, some species change based on habitat quality and the species density. Coyotes, for example, can be more R-selected in areas where they're harvested or die frequently. They can have up to 10 pups per litter. In areas where the population is pretty stable, they may only have 3 or 4 pups per litter. On the opposite extreme is what we call K-selected species. So that grizzly bear up in the upper corner, she's going to have 1 to 3 young every 3 to 4 years. Now that's very few compared to 10,000 per nest. But she'll live longer and she'll produce several litters over the course of her life. So these K-selected species sexually mature later, long gestation periods, lots of parental care, and a long lifespan. So yes, you and I are what we would call K-selected species. We also, as biologists, want to know the biotic potential or biological potential of each species. And what that is the maximum number of young that can be produced each year. So for example, a fly, believe it or not, can produce almost 5 million young in a year if it survives all that time. So a Gambel's quail can produce 16 eggs in a clutch in 1 year, if it's a good year. On average, they produce 8. So the biological potential is not what the animal always produces, but if you're trying to build a model on what's going to happen with the population, you need to know what the potential is and what the reality is. If the reality is so much lower than the potential, then you might need to do some research to find out what the problem is. So if we look at the biotic potential, if we had 16 Gambel's quail, if each Gambel's quail had 16 eggs per clutch, you guys would not be able to walk around in your hometown if all those young survive. In about 6 years, the population would quadruple. In about 10 years, for example, on the ASU campus I worked at, I figured out that in 6 years, you wouldn't be able to walk without stepping on a Gambel's quail. So animals have the ability to reproduce rapidly and populate an entire area. Why don't they? Because of lack of food and nutrients, lack of water, lack of suitable habitat, weather, predators, disease, parasites, and competitors. And we call that environmental resistance. I've seen them called resistance factors. I've seen them called welfare factors, limiting factors. I don't really care what you call it, but just realize that all of these can really limit a population size. And thank God they do, because animals there wouldn't be any space left to sit. So if you look at a population, this is a population curve, and this is fictitious, this is just theoretical. So on this curve, you can see this population is growing, and it's at that biotic potential. It's at its maximum rate of increase. And it finally gets to the top, and then it dies. There's no food left. There's no water left. There's no cover left for it to hide in from predators. And there's a huge die-off. This is called a J-shaped curve. This is something that in conservation we don't want. It's not healthy for the population to keep going up and then drop, and then up and then drop. And the main reason is because they can start destroying the habitat in which they live in. What most populations do have is an S-shaped curve, and that's a population that reaches what we call a carrying capacity, which we'll go into here in a second. And then because of weather differences, there's going to be changes, diseases, etc. over time, but it's going to vacillate around this mean over time, and you can pretty much predict, or at least hopefully predict, what the population is going to be. And again, there's your list of limiting factors, environmental resistance, etc. Now here's a population of representation of a real population in J-shape. Now, reindeer or caribou were moved on St. Matthew's Island, which is right off the coast of Alaska. They moved 29 of them there in 1944. The population went along slowly for about 10 or 11 years, and then it reached a size that it just exploded. And it went up to 6,000 animals in a short period of time, less than 10 years. And then they literally had nothing to eat, and they died. They starved themselves out, so there were only 42 left. Now, in a place with Arctic tundra, which is a very fragile ecosystem, our desert is very much the same. If we had populations going through this on our desert, the ecosystem would be destroyed. We'd lose our soil. The vegetation's gone, can't hold the soil there, and the population will never come back. So again, in conservation, we try and prevent that from happening. When might you see a J-shaped curve in a population of animals? When an animal is introduced to an area, there's no predators. After a fire or other disturbance, could be no absence of competitors. After a die-off and there's good habitat, all the young have food and they keep reproducing. And then when predators are removed, you can get a J-shaped curve. And predators are important because they maintain that herbivore population from exceeding carrying capacity. And again, we don't want those crashes. The size of the population is maintained such that overuse does not occur, and that's what we hope for. That's what we hope predators are doing. So in carrying capacity, again, here's a biological definition: the number of individuals of a population that the environment can support over an indefinite period of time. The number will change from year to year, but should average out as long as the habitat remains the same. Most of you guys know where the White Tank Mountains are. There is a finite number of grass blades. There is a finite number of bushes in that mountain range. Therefore, there is a finite number of deer that can live there, because they are 100% dependent on those autotrophs, those plants, to produce their energy that they need. It's going to vacillate over time, especially in an area like in the southwest where we have such variable rainfall. Deer population may be 1,000 one year, 500 the next, 1,500 the next, 1,200 the next, 800. I'm just making those numbers up. I don't know what the real numbers are, but and that is the carrying capacity. It's essentially, if you have a geographic area, the number of plants in that area is finite. If it gets any larger, animals are going to start to starve and die, and usually the young and the old. Okay, we talked about the importance of predators, and predator-prey balance is discussed in a lot of ecology texts. And here's the classic curve. You have an increase in moose, then you have an increase in wolves. The wolves keep the moose from hitting the carrying capacity, and they decline. But then the moose come back up, then as the moose are down, the wolves decline. But what happened here? The moose went way up, and the wolves did not follow them to keep them from going over carrying capacity, which is why you had this big crash here. That's the real world. Sometimes there's things like diseases and everything else that kind of make models and theories and don't always work. So do we know where the carrying capacity of moose is? Not really. I assume it's somewhere in here, but we don't know. That's something that would take more time. Why is the habitat most important? Because essentially, as long as that land and those plants are there and aren't destroyed, the moose will come back. They have the ability to do it. And so will the wolves. Look at them here. They are coming back themselves. Let's skip that next question. So again, looking at environmental resistance, the three biggies that keep populations from exploding: lack of food, lack of water, lack of cover. Predation is another key one. We didn't think it was important as when I was younger as we do now. We know it's much more important now. So these two species here in Arizona maintain populations and help them from, it's not like each animal is doing this, I'm going to kill this deer to save the ecosystem. No, this mountain lion is killing the deer so it can eat. The deer isn't giving itself up to save the habitat for the other deer. Remember, animals are selfish. But the system being the way it is, predators kill the prey species, and normally those prey species can reproduce real fast. They do, but those predators keep them down, and hopefully they don't harm the habitat. When we're looking at, again, as a conservation biologist or wildlife biologist, I like to say we classify mortality rates as what we call density dependent or density independent. If you've got all these elk crowded together, competing with each other for plants, competing with each other for food, spreading diseases because they're close together, all of those are density dependent forms of mortality. Density independent is when a weather catastrophe, if you have a huge blizzard, it wouldn't matter if there was only 2 elk in those pictures, they would die. So density dependent and density independent are 2 different forms of mortality. When you have dense populations, like the data says here, on a rabbit on a particular island, 4 rabbits per acre produce 13 young per year. At a density of 0.3 per acre, so instead of 4, there was only a third of a rabbit. I never received a third of a rabbit. They produce 24. And remember the coyote examples earlier. Animals can reproduce much faster when they're at a lower density because they're not competing with each other for food. That's the take home. Density independent mortality, weather, pesticides, and the biggie, loss of habitat. Loss of habitat is the primary reason for populations declining. It's the primary reason for extinction across the world, our extinction crisis. It's followed closely by introduced species. and introductions of non-native and exotic species result in the degradation of ecosystems. You bring in another species to eat the food, to drink the water, to take up the space an animal needs. You're reducing the number of young native animals can produce. This is an example in Australia, and years ago, in the 1940s, they brought rabbits to Australia so they could hunt. Well, there's no natural predators to rabbits in Australia, and all the jokes about rabbits are true. They do reproduce a lot, and they just became almost billions of numbers in Australia, and they ate everything, and they destroyed the habitat. Unfortunately, Australia has high numbers of invasive species, and they're destroying a lot of the plant life there, and the native kangaroos and wallabies are all having a difficult time because of it. You can see that this fence, you can see how much damage there was done. They were introduced in 1859. They ended up using a disease to control the rabbit population, and it's been successful for a while, but it may not work in the long term, and that's because you might have a mutation in the rabbit population that allows them to be resistant to the disease. And as we know from the last 2 weeks, we can look at if they're resistant to that disease, that mutation is going to be selected for, and you now may have rabbits that are resistant to that disease. I can't say that it's going to happen. It's always a possibility, though. We also look at mortality in two different ways. Is it additive, or is it compensatory? And this has to do primarily with when animals are killed. So, for example, in an area where there's high amounts of snow, there's going to be 30 to 40% of the deer are going to die every year. There's just not enough food. It's too hard on them to survive. So every deer that a wolf kills, or a pack of wolves kills, is one deer that will be able to survive that winter because it wasn't the one that died. That makes sense? Birds migrating. Only about 30% of birds that fly south for the winter make it back. And that's on the high end for a lot of bird species. So that's any time that an animal is taken out of that population, it probably was going to die anyway. So it's not as big a concern if you're involved in conservation. We'll come back to that here real quick. There's three major facets of wildlife management, at least from the agency I came from, Game and Fish. And one is to maintain animals for the population and purpose of harvest. I should have changed the order here. The second is the preservation of species. And this is something you probably don't know much about, and Game and Fish doesn't do it, but the federal government does. And that's control of excess animals considered nuisance species. The father of wildlife management was Aldo Leopold. You're going to be reading another one of his stories this week. You also read The Odyssey, which he wrote. And he defined wildlife management as the art, not the science, but the art of making land produce sustained animal crops, wild game for recreational use. And this was in the 30s. He wrote the first textbook. He started the first wildlife biology program at the University of Wisconsin in the 30s. So this was a long time ago. We don't just produce animals to be killed by hunters anymore. So it's evolved way past that. But it still is a very important part of wildlife management. And one of the things that we have done is we have gotten rid of our predators. How many wolves did you see on the way to school today? They were here. How many grizzly bears? The last grizzly bear was killed in Arizona in 1937 on Escadilla Mountain up by Springerville. So we had larger predators in this state, and we've taken them away. Therefore, deer and elk populations can go into a J-shaped curve if they're not controlled in some method. we as humans have been doing that, and we primarily do it by hunting. So if the hunters are allowed to take animals, they keep the population from going over carrying capacity and potentially destroying the habitat. So the answer to that question is, can hunters take the role of predators? Absolutely. Absolutely. Two other key reasons for hunting. It's a little off subject, but hunters pay for almost all of the wildlife conservation in our country. Arizona Game and Fish gets no tax dollars, none whatsoever. It all comes from the sale of hunting and fishing licenses. So if you buy a hunting or fishing license, you're paying for the conservation of many species in this state. Now, the endangered species is paid for by the federal government and taxes. There's also a tax on duck stamp, but that's essentially you're charging hunters again to provide refuges for waterfowl. So they do provide this. You may not like hunting, but please realize they are, hunters do have an ecological role as long as they're maintained, and they do pay for most of the conservation that you probably like to see. The third thing is people like to do it. I think we have to ask ourselves, if we don't like something, do we have the right to tell somebody else that they can't do it if it's not harming anything? I mentioned control of nuisance species. That's something that goes on more than I think most urban people realize. There are government trappers, federal government trappers throughout the state of Arizona that kill mountain lions, that kill coyotes to reduce predation on cattle, primarily sheep. It could be killing blackbirds in Indiana to keep them out of cornfields. It could be killing geese in San Francisco to keep them away from the airport. And since we had a jet land in the Hudson Bay because it sucked in geese, most people realize that that's important. We also use predator control to protect endangered species, which most people see as fine. At least I've spent quite a bit of time reading studies that have polled people to see what their attitudes are on predator control. Most people think predator control is okay if the prey is harming the habitat. Predator control is okay even to help livestock, but they don't like it just to produce big game animals as trophies. When predator control is needed for wildlife is usually when we're talking about endangered species. So when we move to endangered species, and we're going to be talking about this in about 2 to 3 weeks, we start asking ourselves, what is the minimum number of animals needed to maintain a population or species? The sad reality is, once you get under 50, that animal species is probably gone. Once you get under 500, it's really bad. It's just, for a great number of reasons, way too many. We could talk about that all semester. I was part of a big study where we looked at desert bighorn populations in isolated mountain ranges, and once those populations got under 100, there was a high probability that the population in that mountain range, can't speak today, would go extinct. We try and keep 500, but many times species are being lower this. We still work at it, but if you hear conservation laws go into an effect when there's under 500 animals, maybe now you'll have a little better idea of realizing once an animal population gets under 500, the probability of extinction goes way up. Remember when we talked about density dependent or density independent mortality? Why is that important? If we go all the way back to that picture with all the elk in it, in endangered species, you're never going to have that. So if you have a population of 50 cheetahs as a subspecies in a small area in Namibia, they're not going to outcompete each other and die. they're going to be wiped out because of a density independent type of mortality, diseases, weather, etc. So this is a very, very short, brief introduction to animal populations, what controls them, what makes them grow, and how conservationists look at it, wildlife biologists. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope I didn't stutter too much. And there will be a quiz on this. Just go back and read your PowerPoint. It'll be right there. Thank you. Whoops, now I look like a fool here.